I remember looking at the weekly report and realizing like the business hadn't adapted at all. Literally at all. Again, I'm sure that people listening can relate to this. It kind of just yanks you back in, right? And the reason behind that was, in retrospect, we hadn't built systems. I think what we built was a dependency. And so I think my hero doctor was really a gut punch. A gut punch like, this isn't a company. This is like a pet, like an organism that only survives if I keep giving it my time.
An organism that only survives if you keep feeding it your time. Sound familiar? That's Dr. Jason Green, somebody you've probably never heard of because he's impossible to find online. No podcast, barely any photos online, just a chiropractor who quietly built a practice from $2.5 to $40 million. And he did it by figuring out the one thing that most chiropractors never do: how to stop being the bottleneck that the business requires, how to stop being the thing that the business runs on. In this episode, Jason breaks down the hero doctor trap and how to get out of it, why opening a second location just means replicating chaos under a second roof, the 3 numbers you should be looking at every Monday morning to make sure your practice is actually winning, and how he takes 4 to 8 weeks off every summer with his family while his business continues to run without him. If your practice wouldn't survive a week without you, this is the episode you need to hear. Let's dive in. Jason, my man, welcome to the show. How you doing, brother?
Excellent, my man. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, Corey.
I did a little digging, and you're impossible to find. So this will be fun for you and all the listeners and watchers to this episode because you are a wealth of knowledge, especially when it comes to business, especially when it comes specifically to chiropractic businesses and healthcare businesses. And it doesn't seem like there's a lot of content or information from your brain on the internet. I couldn't even find photos of you, just so you know. So I'm excited to dig into everything you know because this seems to be like super secret hidden sauce. So I'm excited to do this, man. Thanks for coming.
Let's unravel. I'm excited to get going.
Let's do it. So the first thing I want to kick things off with is this idea of a hero doctor. And I know that this is a big hurdle and a big thing for people to overcome because they have all these control issues and they want to hold on to everything and they never really scale and they can't figure out why. And it's like, what's the deal with that? Because this is such a common conversation that I have. And I'll be honest, I also have control issues. So I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I would say the hero doctor is something that a lot of providers and probably particularly a lot of your audience are exposed to. I know that I myself, I was exposed to hero doctor syndrome. And I think the first time that I really realized this was, or how deep I was into, kind of being the center of all things in the practice was really when I tried to pull back and work on the business rather than in it, Corey. And so, I think there was a point where we were growing fast. We were adding providers, and my week still looked like a full clinic schedule. But I think the main difference was I had everybody else's problems, right? So I had every angry patient, I had every angry staff member or conflict, I had every complex or complicated case somehow was escalated to me, and somehow all of that would show up on my plate. And so I made what I thought was a smart move, Corey, and I cut my clinical hours and I wanted to free up my time for, strategic projects. And I think in my head, what I was trying to do was I was trying to become a real CEO. So I was trying to be the hero and trying to be the guy who can run all things for the business and run all things within the business. And I figured if I just made that clean separation and went from, COO, chief operating officer, all the, doing all the day-to-day to then CEO, everything was going to be great. And my glide path into that CEO position was going to be, effortless and smooth. And I think the reality was that 30 days later, the numbers smacked me in the face. And I think that probably a lot of doctors suffer from this, and then they lose confidence. And so they just get back into the clinic 100% again. And they kind of throw their hands up and they say, I don't necessarily know what to do next. And for me, I went through that, collections dipped, new patient conversion softened, right? Staff were literally saying, and I got reports of it, we'll just wait until Dr. Jason's here. And so like the cases from other doctors and other specialists within the clinic that they were perfectly capable of handling were getting bumped onto my schedule because, again, it was complicated. And so my calendar, which I had just cleared 30 days before, was magically full again. And I remember looking at the weekly report and realizing like the business hadn't adapted at all, literally at all. And so it And again, I'm sure that people listening can relate to this. It kind of just yanks you back in, right? And the reason behind that was, in retrospect, we hadn't built systems. I think what we built was a dependency. And so I think my hero doctor was really a gut punch, like, this isn't a company. This is like a pet, or like an organism that only survives if I keep giving it my time, right? And so that was a real wake up call, and that's when I had to. I think for me at least, I had to make a very conscious shift in identity, and my and this is something I struggled with for a long time, Corey. It was like, um, I had to make the very clear decision to say my job was not to be the best clinician or the best firefighter. My job was to make sure, whether I was in the building or not, that the numbers looked the same or even better. And so it was uncomfortable. My ego didn't love not being the hero, but I think that's perhaps the inflection point that a lot of people needed to hear or will need to hear. It's certainly what I needed to hear and what I needed to be coached through, which was, when your presence is no longer the solution to everything, you finally have a shot of building something scalable instead of just an exhausting job.
We love to be the hero, don't we? I think it's rooted in our desire to be even a practitioner or a doctor or some person of authority where people come to us because we have the answers and we're the guru and we're special and we're the unicorn and we got sparkles that, shoot out of our butts and we're amazing. But in reality, we can't really ever grow from that. So what did you do then? Like, what did you do to stop having to be the one to feed the beast, I guess, to use your analogy? Like, obviously you mentioned the systems and the processes, which I think a lot of people have heard, but maybe even more fundamentally than that. And like, what did you have to shed? Like, what part of you do you have to let go? Because I literally just, I think 2 days ago, had a call with another doctor, and after the call, or after the recording, after the podcast interview, we started talking about her business, and it was very clear she's in this position. She has control issues, and it was like she's responsible for doing all the sales, all the day ones, and it was like, you need to let that go. So like, what do you do, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I wish there was, a magic roadmap or a path, but at the end of the day, it's very slow and painstaking and boring work. But at the end of the day, everybody has to go through it if you want to scale. And it starts with, I think, at least for me, it started with letting go. Right. And so when I look at kind of what growth looked like for our organizations, where we went from, one clinic to 7 clinics, expanded service line, expanded providers, expanded, how I could show up and provide value in leadership to coach and groom these individuals and these systems, and the process. It took getting out of my own way. And so, if you look at, for instance, what I looked like, or even what the clinic looked like, in those early days, day one. I mean, we were a good clinic. We were doing, 1.8, then 2, then 2.5 mil, out of one center, which was pretty good for just being open a couple of years. And it was me. The system was basically me, right? The system was me and maybe a couple of other providers. And everybody said you had to have data, so like there would be a couple Excel sheets, but really it was just it was for lack of better words, it was a lot of tribal knowledge, right? And so like you asked what had to change. Well, I think for me, reported to me, whether that was formal or informal, they reported to me. And so like training was shadow me for a few days or a few weeks, then you'll figure it out. Our marketing strategy was, whatever we could hustle to drum up that month. The KPIs lived in my head, right? And so like, and maybe on like a board somewhere, like in a break room, but like everything was reactive. We'd get together primarily when something was on fire and we'd talk about that thing. And so like it worked because the size of the clinic, the scale was small, and I could personally hold the thing together. But if I wanted to get out of my own way, and by the time we got to a second, a third, a fourth location, that approach would have killed us, right? The company had to evolve. I had to evolve. And so like when I look at those locations, and I know you asked more about me and kind of like the individual characteristics that I had to give up, but I think this transitions into like, what has to happen at the center? What has to happen organizationally? Because that then shapes who you as an individual need to be. And so at multiple locations, and as we're talking at scale, but it started with one clinic, we had to have like real, as it sounds, you had to have a real org, clinical director, site director, each clinic, right? You had to have, if you have multiple centers, you have to have department heads over disciplines, and you have to have like a small central leadership team. People, like, the thing that was a magic shift for me was the day that people recognized who exactly they reported to and who owned what decisions. And it didn't flow centrally through me. And that took time. We had to develop that process, and then we had to train on that process. And change management's not easy, right? And so when we talk about, standardizing that and rolling that out, you really do have to codify that. You have to have written processes for just about everything in the clinic, right? Hiring, onboarding, firing, clinical flows, best practices, marketing campaigns, financial closes, all of these things. Like, if they weren't in place, Corey, by the time we went to open another clinic, it would have never got off the ground. So 80% of what we needed was already done and documented by that time. And so I think, bringing visibility to the fact that you actually need structure, you need organization, and you need processes that people actually follow, that made all the difference in how I had to show up. And so when we really got to work on developing those things, it made all the difference. And really, then, okay, it's one thing to develop it, but then how do you actually have accountability behind it? And so I would be curious to poll the chiropractic audience to see, like, how many clinics actually do have scorecards for each site, right? Like, do they look at visit volume and new patients? Do they look at conversion rates and, onto care plans? Do they look at collections? And here's a big one that not a lot of people talk about, is like capacity utilization and productivity metrics. How are we? And so you monitor that through scorecards, and then through like a standard meeting cadence instead of reactive meetings, which is what we had. So we would have daily huddles and then weekly huddles to manage the day-to-day, and a weekly leadership review. And now, with all of our centers that we're a part of, we have, weekly business reviews, monthly business reviews, quarterly business reviews, because it's a commitment to want to grow, and it's a commitment to want to get out of your own way. So I think as my role changed, I had to show up differently. Instead of being kind of let's say the hub to every spoke, I had to show up in a different way and provide value in a different way, and really designing the machine and coaching the people who ran it. So, because it wasn't going to run itself.
I love that you brought up the capacity efficiency. It's actually something I just recently built as like an app. I've been doing a lot of nerdy vibe coding stuff lately, speaking of AI, and it was actually something I recently built. Was like, it puts in certain numbers of how many rooms you have and how many doctors you have, how many patients you're seeing, and actually takes into consideration, like, are you actually utilizing the space? Because without question, the biggest expenses to a practice is probably staff and rent, if I had to guess, for most clinics. And so it's funny, I actually just recently built something like that. But on that note of removing yourself from the hub of the business, so going from, I guess, one location to 7 locations, was this like an evolving process throughout the growth and the expansion of the business? Or was this something that you were at a single location, drowning in work, not able to remove yourself from it, and you're like, all right, I need to create the system, and then the system just replicated? I would hope it was the latter, but I would have to assume it's the former, but go for it.
Yeah. I, when people hear that we went, in a couple of years from 2.5 million to around 40 million, they oftentimes think it was like some magic marketing play or some hyper growth hack, right? The truth is, it's a lot less sexy. It was slow, sometimes painful, right? The evolution goes from, for lack of better words, heroes and helpers to, like, let's say, systems and operators, right? And so that's always an evolving process. It's never perfected, and anybody that tells you any different is wrong, because you can always better your process. Yeah, that's, I don't know if I answered your question, but it took a realization moment. It took a lot of self-inflection and reflection to say, hey, we've got to change this. And I think one of the biggest mistakes you can make as an individual, let alone an owner or an operator, is letting the same mistake happen twice. Because if you make a mistake, you should be able to document that mistake and learn from that mistake. And so that was one thing I didn't do for 7 years in my career. And that's something that now I do consistently, because I want to learn from it. If we drop the ball, it's either a people problem or a problem. and always process first. Did this person have succeeded in the process? And if not, then we've got to fix the process. And if so, then we have to take it up with the individual.
Can you dig deeper into that for me? A people problem or a process problem? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, so if something fails or if something's failing or a metric is consistently not where you want it to be, then you have to look at all the different elements that are involved in that process, right? And so you have to look at each piece of it and micro step it out. So what does the SOP, the standard operating procedure of that look like? And then from there, we have to say, is this completely optimized? Is it not? Where is the failure point in that process? And if there is a failure point, then we need to fix that and we need to run through and test it again. If there's no failure points, then we have to say, is that person running the process as designed? And that's where QA and QC come into play, right? Like, are you quality assuring? Do we have, compliance? And do we have a standard for how we're supposed to do things in our practice? And is this monitored? Are people held accountable? And so if they're following the process, then a lot of times, if the process is failing, it's a process problem. And if it's a people problem because they're either not following the process or it's certain elements about how they're delivering the process, we change that and we work on that with the individual. So I don't know if I dug into that enough, but that's how we approach it.
No, that's spot on. I love that. It gives you a step-by-step process on how to actually solve the problem. I'm curious then, though, for the fellow perfectionists out there, like myself, what do you do or what do you say or how do you remove yourself from not endlessly optimizing the process? Because I think you nailed it. I don't think you can ever have the perfect process. There's always opportunities for improvements. And so it's like you could get caught in the rabbit hole of forever improving without ever actually allowing it to run.
Yeah, I mean, so my theory on this is a pretty common theory these days. It's, I was coached by Alex Hormozy to a certain extent. So we went out to acquisition.com. So I subscribe to a lot of his information and the portfolio team there. And they're big on what is widely known as the theory of constraints right now. And so why continue to work on a problem if that's not the biggest problem, if that's not the key focus metric that's really going to change the trajectory of the business? And so, I could spend all day working on little problems or little processes that don't work. But if we took all of our leadership or all of the strategic heads in any business, whether that's just you and a front office staff or you and an office manager or you and a couple providers, or you have a leadership team, and everybody focus their efforts on that one key constraint, if you could solve one problem now that would double the business in 180 days, what would that problem be? And so for me, I don't get caught up in the minutia of solving every single problem. I have a target reference range that I want that to fall into. And then from there, if it's been at that baseline and hitting that target reference range, we nudge that number a little bit and we incentivize around that, a base, a target, and a reach goal around that for each of those metrics. But it doesn't become a problem unless it's, directly relating to one of the main constraints. And so the way that I look at business, the way I look at brain restore centers or any of the other businesses, the clinics that I'm associated with, is each business has 3, possibly 4 company objectives for the year. And so we have 3 to 4 company objectives. And from that, each one of those company objectives, Corey, has 3 to 4 key results, if that, sometimes 2. So if what we're doing does not ladder up and the change that we're trying to make in the organization is not laddering up to one of those strategic objectives, it's not on the plate. Everything is focused towards one of those 4. Everything's got to ladder up to that. And so whether that's, let's say, lead management or sales and conversion or data optimization or average revenue per clinic or whatever that may be, we work tirelessly towards that objective and hitting the key results with that objective. And so we backtrack and reverse engineer so that everything we do is a weekly input. So everybody knows their weekly inputs and the number of inputs they need to hit every single week or every single day to ladder up to hitting that key result. And so that's the way that we approach it. So we certainly don't try to fix everything. So to answer your question and close the loop on that, we try not to get lost in the things that don't move the needle and aren't the key constraint of the business or don't ladder up to one of the 4 company objectives for the year.
Which leads me to the obvious next question is I can already hear somebody listening or watching this thinking to themselves of, I don't know what my key objective is. What do you do?
So you have to identify what your key constraint is. So what is the one thing that you need to solve for, or the 3 things over the year that you need to solve for?
And how do you define that though, right? Like I think that people would get that from a philosophical standpoint, But what is maybe the question they could ask themselves to define what that is?
Okay, so go through. Here's a real world example. You could look at a couple different percentages, right? If you're going at this off of data, you could say, hey, I want to grow my practice. I'm at $500,000. I want to grow to 750 this year. 50% jump. That's what I want to do. And you look at historical data for the last 90 days, and you say, hey, my closing rate is this. I'm closing patients into care plans at 40%, and I have this many leads come through the door, and I have this many escalating through the care process, or I have this lever for retention and lifetime value. And you look at the percentages of each of those and you do the math. And so which one would make the biggest incremental difference? If I took my closing percentage from 40% to 60%, what kind of laddering up would that have on the business? You'd grow the business right there by 50%, right? If I said, hey, I have X number of marketing, but I grew the marketing by 20%, what would that do? Or if I grew the escalation or I grew the lifetime value of the care plan by 20%, what would that do? And you narrow it down to which one is going to have the biggest change downstream for you. And so for us, one of the biggest things that we had to work on was closing percentage. And if we raised the closing percentage by 8 points, it grew the business by 40%, right? It grew the business by 60%. And so what did we do? Well, we worked on the closing percentage. We worked on everything leading up for patient nurture up until that point, the decision point in their care plan. We worked on what are the sales enablement assets? What are the presentation assets? What's the micro scripting and the checkpoint, the 22-point script that needs to be hit up until that point. And not only did we blow past 8%, we went up 32%. And when you grow up 32%, we 3x the business. And so it's little things like that, like what incremental changes will make the biggest difference? Because a lot of people will say, I need more patients. I need more new patients. That's going to solve everything. I need more fresh blood. But in reality, the average revenue per patient, the lifetime value, the case value, whatever metric you want to put on that, and they're all a little bit nuanced different, that may not be the issue, right? The new patient may not be the issue. The retention or the ascension into membership or the conversion of them into an actual care plan. It's not just lead generation or lead nurture or lead conversion into appointment or show rate. It's some of these other metrics that move the business significantly faster and further.
It's not sexy, but it's the right answer, my friend. Got to know your data. I
Yeah.
want to,
Yeah.
I want to shift gears a little bit here into what I would call the second location trap. In
Sure.
that, I think that a lot of practitioners and business owners and doctors believe that expanding to multiple locations is the answer. I see it all the time, and they think like magically, if they double locations, they somehow like double their intake and et cetera, et cetera. But I think that this is a misconception. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's a massive misconception. I think when done correctly, it's incredible. But I think the misconception that you're referring to is clinic 1 is working, clinic 2 is just a copy paste and I'll double my income. When in reality, what actually happens most of the time is you take all of the unresolved problems from the first clinic and you spread them across 2 roofs, right? And you cut your attention in half. And so, when people ask me, should I open a second location? Because I get asked this quite a bit. I used to do a lot of practice management. We do a lot of JV, do a lot of bolt-on centers. I often say, let's talk about when you absolutely should not do it. And so I guess what I can do is I can share a couple of red flags for you that I look for when you should not open a center. And they're pretty clear cut to me. I think most clinicians and most entrepreneurs would understand this. The biggest thing to me clearly is like, you're not maxed out in the first clinic, right? So how do you judge that? Well, I think just a quick back of napkin rule here is like, if your prime hours aren't consistently at 80% plus full, you don't need more rent. You need better utilization, right? So like, as an example, if you can park your car in your own parking lot at 4 p.m. and you see a bunch of empty spaces, that's a sign, right? And so you need to max out the first clinic, okay? But you need to max it out the right way. And so when we talk about maxing it out the right way, we have to do it in a way in which margins are not thin or inconsistent. And I think that a lot of people get busy and have great volume, but have terrible financials. And when you look at EBITDA or EBITDA margin and real, value adders to a clinic, a lot of people don't have that metric right. So like they'll have good and bad months in one location, and then they think by taking on a second lease or a second build out, that adding another location isn't going to amplify that volatility, and it does. And so the second location, Corey, it multiplies whatever your current economics are, right? If the first engine is shaky, a second engine doesn't fix it. Right. At the end of the day, as simple as that sounds, it's true. And I think an engine can become shaky because of process and what I was talking about earlier, right? Like nothing's written down. And so if you have a first location that you're doing a lot of volume and you're bursting at the seams, and maybe you're running out of square footage, you can't reduce appointment times, you can't expand hours, you can't expand footprint, and you're like, hey, and the margins are good. The next checkpoint is your process documented, right? Like your hiring, your onboarding, like what I talked about earlier, how you present care plans, how your front desk runs phone handling or scripting, or is it more the case like your marketing's in your head, and so like if you double or add another location, you're not replicating process, you're replicating you. And so like a second location with no playbooks, I've done this, right? Like it just means you spend your life driving between buildings and answering the same questions. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that at all. So like, I think as with anything else, you need a champion. You need somebody that's a savage in your new site and in your organization. And so I try not to expand unless we have the person or the selection of individuals that are ready to be the obvious leader for that site. So like, I'm really, really big on people and on culture. And if you can't point to a person and say, if I drop them into that new building and they're running this playbook, if you don't have that, then it's going to be hard to make that run. And so I don't think you're ready. And so I think one of the failures is again, the owner trying to put everything on their back and be the de facto clinic director in every site. And that's a recipe for disaster. So I think when a doc says to me, should I open a second location? I try to flip it and say, like, doc, if we cloned what you're doing right now, would we be duplicating a high margin, tightly run machine, or would we be like replicating chaos? And so
if I had to guess, I think I know the answer to that for probably most clinics. So let's say the person listening right now is that person, right? Like the owner feels like they're walking through their parking lot and there's a bunch of empty parking spots. What can they do to maybe increase their current capacity or squeeze more value out of what they're already doing? How does somebody do that?
So there's a couple different frameworks you can use here. I'll try to think of a few that are like consistent across multiple clinics. How about we turn it into data? Like if I said, hey, these are weekly data points that you could like get a snapshot, and this, we can make this super simple, right? So like if I look at 3 to 4 growth levers that I think every clinic should look at weekly, I would tell you it's got to be access, right? So hours and availability. I would tell you it's got to be capacity, and it's got to be case value, right? So like, I think we've got to get more efficient at all of these 3 things. And so I can go into different metrics on that. But I think just from a high level flow, I think most owners build around their schedule and their preferences and not necessarily demand, right? So like we talked about, are your prime blocks full, like 4 p.m., early mornings, evenings, lunch hours, are they fully, utilized? Or could you add a couple, like a Saturday block, and capture a slice of patients who don't come in 9 to 5 because, you can a lot of times pick up 10 to 30% more volume just by aligning your hours with how your community actually lives, right? I think provider and room capacity are big ones. Like, so if you look at you look at your office as an asset and you say, how many provider hours are theoretically available per week? How many are we actually using, right? Because we don't want our clinic rooms sitting half empty. Yeah, I think there's a couple different ways to look at that. And when we talk about case value and plan integrity, you know, obviously that's a big one because a lot of clinics are under earning, not because of low volume. I think volume tends to be a big thing in chiropractic. If anything, it's, you know, it's like we're seeing so much volume, but they're under earning because they're under treating or they're undercharging, right? Like they're either consistently recommending like a not ideal care plan, or they're pre-discounting in their head because they feel bad. I think that patients need to understand their journey and the why behind it. So yeah, I think that's a couple things that you could just like off the cuff that you could look at just right away, very easily.
I love that you brought up the hours one, because I can safely say that, oh God, I'd say 95% of clinics that I see, and this isn't a judgment thing, this is just purely an observation. They are typically open, you know, 2 to 3 days a week, and they have a half day somewhere in there, maybe. And the reason I find this interesting is because I literally, again, just the previous podcast interview that I did is one of the questions that I asked, again, off call or off podcast interview, is I go, I was like, well, because they're only open 3 days a week. And I was like, well, why don't you just like create a second team, right? Like you have one team work these hours that you obviously enjoy working, you do all the sales and you're converting these. That's great. Well, why don't you just like create a second team to work the off hours? And the answer was, again, control issues, right? And it's just this is no judgment, right? Is like, I get it, I have control issues myself, and obviously it's your baby and you have all this, like, you have a certain quality you want to hit, and I get all this, but at the same time, is it fair to say that that's probably just self-limiting beliefs or just lack of trust in someone else's ability to do good work? I mean, what do you think that is?
I mean, I think it comes back to what we started the conversation off with, which is that they want to be, you know, to a certain degree, it's trust and it's hero doctor, right? I think that there's either a lack of trust or there's an ego component to it. You know, at the end of the day, if you own the clinic, like for instance, this doctor, I have no idea who this was, but like you can't personally work or want to work every single hour seeing patients. I love to work. Don't get me wrong. I love what I do for a living. I enjoy it. I could work, you know, 5 a.m. to 11 p.m. I really enjoy it. But I would argue that most chiropractors don't love seeing patients that long, right? Like they want to work on the business. So like there's got to be some hours that you personally don't want to work in the clinic. And if you don't add a second body to cover that, an associate to cover that, you're not maximizing capacity. You're not maximizing opportunity. And so something as simple, Corey, is like splitting shifts so the building is productive from early to late instead of like a big dead zone in the middle makes a massive difference. 20%, 30%, 40% right there, just by making a small shift. So yeah, I think there is, to answer your question, I think there's trust and there's letting go and there's ego in there.
Let's talk about lifetime value for a second. I know you're building Brain Restore right now, and I want to know, when you're looking at new service lines or ways to increase lifetime value or how much you can make from a patient, how do you differentiate between something just being distracting that's going to break your operations and something that can actually really add revenue to the business?
So if I heard you correctly, you're talking about, are you asking me specifically about like bolting on a service? Like when is it an engine versus when is it a distraction?
Yeah, and it could be anything, right? Like it could be decompression. It could be, I mean, I don't know, whatever you're into. But
Yeah, these are all opportunities. I think when you get to a certain level, I should say, that people bring you opportunities every week, right? Like you're going to get presented new tech, new protocols, new supplements, new diagnostics, right? You name it, right? The challenge is everything is going to sound good, and you can't say yes to everything, because if you did, you'd end up with a Frankenstein clinic where nobody's clear on what you actually do or what actually makes money. So when I look at bolting on services, I kind of go through that kind of simple but ruthless filter, which is it a distraction or is it an engine? And so I usually run through 4 lenses when I do this. The lenses, I'll share them. I mean, we're all providers, right? So lens number one is clinical integrity, right? Does this, I'm thinking about adding clinically improve outcomes for a patient that we already serve, right? Not could it help someone somewhere someday, right? Does it deepen, what we at our chiropractic center or our integrative center or our brain restore center, does it deepen that transformation for the people that we see? So for brain restore centers, for example, when we're dealing with a chiropractic partner, they already believe in conservative, neurologically focused care. Yeah, of course, there's a musculoskeletal component to it, but neurologically focused is core to our, to our center. And so the brain restore model gives us a way to objectively measure brain function, to target it, to track change over time. So there's clearly clinical steps forward, and it's not a shiny object, right? So clinical efficacy is big for me with any decision I'm making. I don't want to add just another service that's like, this is just a pure money play. Now, money, I think the economical engine is really important. So I'll put that number 2. I think if it works clinically, so if it goes through that filter, yes, it works. Yes, it gets outcome. Then the next question is, does it work economically? So like, for instance, I'm looking for, can we recoup our initial investment in 6 to 12 months? And then it's going to spit off a bunch of healthy profit, not, maybe 5 years from now, I'll pay everything off if it goes perfectly, right? Because at that point, it's just a hobby. It's not a growth engine. So like I look at things like startup cost, equipment, training, marketing, things like that. I look at like, what are the margins per case? And I look at payback period if there's a, capital outlay. So, so that's outcomes and that's economics, which are 2 big things for any provider that's an entrepreneur. And I think the next one is something that, let's say, less seasoned operators will not pay as much attention to, but it's one of the things it ranks up there in my top 3 or 4, which is operational friction, right? So how much complexity does this add to the day-to-day? So like if I'm thinking about bringing on decompression or weight loss and neuropathy or functional med or brain health, right? Like, is it a massive tax on the organization? Because every new service line has a tax. And so if that tax is significant and ongoing, there better be an absolute killer upside. Otherwise, it's just going to slow everything down. So like with Brain Restore, we're very deliberate about building it onto a contained operating system. Defined roles, defined data, defined structure, clear SOPs for everything. So clinics aren't reinventing the wheel. And so with any bolt-on or any add-on, any engine that I'm looking to apply to a clinic, those are the things that have to check the box. And once you have those 3 things, it's getting outcomes. There's significant profit, it's making money, and it's easy to implement. The last really filter criteria is it scalable? Like if it works once, can we turn it into a playbook and replicate it across centers? Or do we have to custom build it every time? Because I don't want to custom build every time. That's the reason I'm excited about what we're doing now. Like we're not just doing one cool thing in one clinic. We've turned it into a standardized joint venture model that most clinics can plug right into. And so we codify it so that a practice can bolt it on predictably. So like, for instance, if a doc asks me about, you said decompression or neuropathy or whatever, weight loss, functional med, brain health, like my answer is not necessarily a yes or a no. I think whatever you're considering, it's got to run through those 4 filters. And so if it gets great outcomes, if the operational load is manageable, if it's got the right economics and you can turn it into a repeatable system, then it's, probably a growth engine. And if it only scores high on like 1 or it sounds cool, it's a distraction, right? So that's how I look at it.
I like that you think in systems and processes, and you're very logical minded, which I can definitely relate with. And on that note, you alluded to something earlier in terms of scorecards. And if you could only look at 3 numbers on a Monday morning to know if your clinic is winning or losing or doing well or doing bad, which ones would you pick?
I get three. So going back to what I said probably 15 minutes ago, I think most clinics would look at new patients, right? I think they would say, hey, I've got to get new blood in the account. But I think there's other metrics that are more valuable. And, I think most clinic owners that I talk to, that really they look at three things. And these are not the three things that I'm going to advise you to look on. But the three things that I would say that most clinics look at is that new patient number. They look at their checking account, right? And maybe they look at their monthly profit, maybe. But I think the problem with looking at like last month's new patients and looking at the checking account then, or looking at, the monthly profit then, is like, it's like you're driving a car, but you're only looking through the rear view mirror. By the time you see a problem, it's already too late. So you've got to look at other components. And so I'm a big fan of operations. I'm really like, this is a big component to me, because I think if you can be operationally strong and you can be a good operator as an entrepreneur, the financials will come and the conversion systems will come. And so I look at, if I'm going to pick three, I'm going to have to say what we talked about earlier, which is labor capacity utilization. And the question I'm trying to answer, Corey, is how full are we really, right? Like how well are we doing? What percentage of available provider hours are actually booked, right? What percentage of prime time slots are full? And if we're sitting at 40, 50% consistently, we may have an access problem, or have a utilization problem. It might be a marketing problem, might be a sales and conversion problem, but we have a big problem with utilization. So, but if we're at 85 and 90% and we're turning people away, it might be time to add hours or find a provider, or, refine our triage, right? So, operational numbers, capacity utilization is big. I think the next thing is, how well are we converting people to care plans? So like the example I gave you around how we went from 40 to 60%, right? I would tell you that new patient conversion to care plan is massive. It's not just, like we said earlier, it's not just how many new patients came in, but it's what percentage actually accept and started the recommended plan of care, right? Because if that number is low, it doesn't matter how many leads you get, right? You're leaking, right? Your boat has holes in it. And so that can point to a number of issues, from weak conversion on day one or day two, the communication, weak nurture, lack of clarity around the problem and really digging into the why, or financial friction that hasn't been solved, right? That's where you got to really follow the 22-point micro checklist of that conversion. And then what are the sales enablement assets? What's the nurture leading up to it? How do we maximize friction and really dive in and kind of pull apart and separate that problem and jump right in and say, hey, we have a solution here. And so that's those are the things that I like to dive into with new patient conversion. And then I think economics and financials, you got to have something there. So we talked about operations, we talked about sales and conversion. You got to talk about financials. And I think the easy way to do this, if you're going to look at this, let's say weekly, I would say collections per visit or per active patient, right? Like it tells you, do the economics match the value you're delivering, right? So if not, we usually have one of three problems. We're usually, like I mentioned earlier, you're under treating. So short care plans, they don't have enough depth. You're underpricing, right? Like the fees are out of sync with how complex it is, or you're just not good at financial arrangements and collections. So those are some of the things that I would look at. Because I think if you look at those, you can usually tell, do you have a lead problem, a sales problem, a pricing problem, or a delivery problem?
I have a document, anybody can find it on my website, where it's totally free, where it shows some of the major KPIs that any high earning clinic owner should know. And also it gives ranges of good, average, bad for some of the major KPIs. It's something I would actually love for you to take a peek at. It's something I've been putting together since working with multiple doctors and et cetera, of trying to dial in if these numbers are accurate or not. I think they're pretty accurate, but I would love for you to take a look at it at some point to see if they make sense and they align with what you've seen with like what are good numbers and bad numbers, because they can be a little subjective, but some of them seem to be pretty accurate. But
Yeah, happy
um,
to. Happy
yeah,
to. Would love to.
you I know you've documented some of your screw ups from over the years,
Yeah.
and I'm curious, what's one expensive mistake that you've journaled about that actually maybe turned out to be a good thing because of maybe what it taught you about business or the lesson you learned or the system you had to create or something of that nature?
Yeah, yeah. So we talked about that in kind of like the pre-show call, right? Like I think you do a really good job with your due diligence leading up to the podcast, and I really enjoyed filling out that questionnaire, like which kind of gave you this insight because it really what it does is it really forces me to kind of like think about what are some of the nuances about me that may be different from somebody else, and I think that something I learned a long time ago was that I'm going to make a lot of mistakes, and that's normal. Everybody makes a lot of mistakes, and to record those mistakes. And so I bookmark a failure journal that I that I like to add to anytime that I'm making a mistake and I need to fix a problem around it and put a process in place. And so like I think if you're going to ask me what was one of the bigger ones, I think big ones come from I think they come from professional immaturity in certain areas and certain thresholds of the business, right? Like running a $500,000 business is very different from running a $2 million business, which is very different from running a $5 million business, a $10 million business, 25 million, 40 million. Like you just have different resources available to you. You have different bosses that you got to beat at every level, right? And so like I would say that the recurring theme that I met consistently early on that I feel like I've gotten a lot better with and I've developed process around is what I call leadership readiness. And so I've promoted the wrong person numerous times into leadership because I thought they were clinically excellent, right? I liked them. I thought they were really good. They were a rock star provider. I'm thinking of one in particular, stud with the patients, great clinically, numbers were solid, right? Like, and I think in my head, I was thinking like, they're crushing it. They're crushing it with patients. They'll crush it running the clinic. And so we ascended them into like site director, clinic director. And so what I didn't account for was that leadership is a completely different job. And so, overnight, I took him out of what he was great at and I gave him a role that he hadn't been trained for. And in retrospect, frankly, didn't want, right? Leadership's not easy. Hard conversations, accountability, firing, conflict resolution, thinking about numbers instead of just personalities and cases, right? And so I think you can probably guess what happened, right? So within a few months, his personal performance dipped because he was stuck in meetings and drama, and the team was confused about what they should even be doing because they weren't given clear direction. And I had to step back in and solve problems that they were avoiding. So like, and that led to 4 to 6 months of downstream problems, like morale flattened. And I remember that phase. Growth stalled. We lost 9 months of momentum in that location. And that was an expensive mistake in both dollars, people, and trust, right? So like I documented a simple one-liner in my journal, which was never confuse clinical excellence with leadership readiness. And so a playbook came out of it. Yep. So we created a leadership track and expectations and training and smaller tests and like, before someone gets the keys to the site. So started looking at different traits and like, can they have uncomfortable conversations? What do they think in systems, or do they think in systems, I should say, instead of like one-off hacks? And like, do people naturally flow to them? So like, yeah, I think for me, I think the take home there to anybody that's listening is like, we have to get comfortable with the idea that our best producers aren't necessarily our best leaders. So yeah.
Somebody will have to fact check me, but I want to say, I think it was Lindsey Vaughn that talked about how she grew up in a household where sitting around the dinner table, that it was almost rewarded to fail. like the question that was always posed was, what did you fail at today? And I think if I remember correctly, that she was saying that it trained her to see failure not as a bad thing, but as a goal to strive for, because it means you're challenging yourself. So I appreciate the fact that you also keep a journal of these failures and these lessons learned, because we always, I mean, anyone will tell you we learn more from our failures than our successes, without question. But
100%. And I think for the audience, I think something that's served me well is most people, especially this time of year, for the last, let's say, 60 days, most people, they strive to lay out their goals, right? What are my goals that I'm going to do for the year? I look at it differently. I look at, like, what did I absolutely not like, and how I showed up to the people and the parts of my life that are most important to me. And I make that list and I rank myself on that list, 0 to 10. And then I pick 2 or 3 of them for the following year. And that's kind of like my personal strategic objectives. How am I going to show up? Is that my marriage? Is that me being, a better father to my 4 kids? Is that financial? Is that real estate? Is that entrepreneurial? What is that? Is that health? What is that? And so I think I put the things that I'm very unhappy with myself about, and I'm hard on myself, just natural, super type A, but it's really helped me to open my eyes. So.
It's funny. I don't do that exactly, but I do something similar in the sense of the last couple years that I've always do the whole yearly. It sounds like we're very similarly mentally wired, but I always do like yearly goal setting, and I break it down into quarters and blah, blah, blah. I'm super nerdy about that stuff. But I would say the last couple years, I've actually, I haven't had really very few, if any, health related goals, because that's not really the area of my life that I need the most growth. And it's probably not the area of my life that also means I'm going to have the biggest opportunity for impact or change. The change that I need, I guess you could say, is like I've been weight training for 25 years. I work out every day. It's a habit. It's a staple of my life. So I don't really need to put a goal around that. The goals I need to put stuff around are more related to like relational things or financial things or business things, like, because those are really where the things are going to change. Because we have a tendency to err towards continuing to do the things we're good at because we're already good at it, as opposed to addressing the things that we know we need to do, but we don't want to do because we suck at it, right? Anyone will tell you is like, yeah, I love doing this thing I'm good at. But the second you try to do something you suck at, not so fun all of a sudden. But those are traditionally the goals you should probably be targeting.
Yeah, they are the biggest unlocks in life. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. I think you bring up a brilliant point for the audience. Brilliant.
Yeah. As we land this plane, I know you got to jump off here. You take a month-long vacation with your family every summer, if I read correctly. So first question is, where are you going this year? And number two is, for the listener listening to the show, I would assume a lot of them can't even take a weekend off, let alone a month off. So how do you organize your business, or how do you structure things so that when you leave, things can run smoothly without you?
Yeah, great question. And thank you for asking. That was, my biggest goals in life 5 years ago were time freedom and geographic freedom. And so I wanted to architect my life so that I could do what I needed to do entrepreneurially, operationally, financially, from anywhere. And as chiropractor, that's a really challenging thing to do. As a business owner, that's a really challenging thing to do. And so to answer your first question, we typically go anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks in our RV. And I take my 4 kids and my wife, and we get really close during that time. And it's great because, you don't have all of the external stressors that come along with day to day, and the kids having to be here and there and do all of their things. Everybody's right with us. And so we're hiking, we're fishing, we're rock climbing, we're camping, we're doing all the things. And it's wonderful for us. We're big outdoor buffs. We love national parks. And so we've been to many of the states, and we've been to a lot of the national parks. And this year we live in the greater Philadelphia area. And so this year will be a couple national parks. From Hot Springs, we'll be heading up through Oklahoma, through Colorado, hitting the 4 in Colorado, South Dakota, before stopping off and seeing some family in Wisconsin. And so yeah, that will be a big 6-week loop is what we have, which is exciting. And so we're going to enjoy every second of it. And so the question really, when people see me take that type of trip, like last year we went to Canada, and we did 7 or 8 provinces in Canada and did a bunch of hikes, and we were on the road for a very long time. And people were lovely. The landscape was lovely. but people will say like, oh, that must be nice, right? Like, that must be nice. Oh, you can do that. Like, what do you do? Like, how do you do it? Like that's nice. Oh, that's great for you. But I think what they don't see is they don't see the years of deliberately building a structure so that it doesn't collapse the second I'm off site. And so I think buying back freedom came down to a couple things. I think it came down to like, you can't be the single point of failure and expect freedom. Right. So you gotta build clear lanes, right? Like I think if you want the ability to be able to have time freedom and geographic freedom and still have the business hum, you need to have some individuals on your team that have leadership capability and they have, authority. And for like, I'm not saying that you need to have a big, 5-person director level team. Most people in the audience listening to this aren't going to have that. But what you can have is you can have clearly defined roles. For instance, you can have somebody who has a confined operations lead role, or somebody that has a confined growth and marketing role, and they get compensated for that role with KPIs and a comp package specific to that. But then, the other half of their week might be geared towards finance or towards something else. So like, I think you have to be able to step back, look at your team now, look at where you want to go and say, how can I implore leadership and authority, but yet have accountability? And so that happens. The accountability piece happens with what we talked about earlier, which is like an operating system, right? Like they need to know like, what are their scorecards? They need to know when there is a problem, what's the escalation path? They need to know like, what is the meeting cadence? And so when they know that and they know the playbooks, if an issue pops up, people don't freeze, they run the play, right? Like if the company is operating off of my mood or my memory, then it's a mess. And so I don't want that. I want it operating off of the system. And I think two more things really. I think if you're going to run a solid company and you're going to travel and you're going to be away, then you need to have a dashboard that travels with you. So like I'm very, very specific about the data that gets pushed out to me every single day or every single week. So I know that it's populating in my inbox with this time on this day, and I get to see whether that's volume, capacity, conversion, collections, cash, whatever the metrics are that I need to see, I can see it. And so like I get a summary of that, and essentially a very simple green, red, yellow scorecarding system. And so if those things are healthy, I don't need to be in a building, period. And if something's off, we address it at a systems level, which I can do remotely. I don't have to jump back in and dive back into operations most times. Doesn't mean it's a perfect system. It just means that's where we're at now, and that's the direction we're heading. And so, and I think the very last piece, and this part could be unsexy to people, is like you start a little bit at a time. You don't start with month-long trips. You start by being gone for a couple of days and then a week. And it's really important that you separate yourself and you don't answer every single text or call or email, right? Like if something's broke, instead of saying, that's why I can't leave, we ask like, what process is missing or what person is missing? And is my presence necessary? So I hope that's helpful.
Jason, this whole conversation's been helpful. What's your plug? Where can people find you?
Yeah, we're doing wonderful things at Brain Restore Centers. We're very excited. Last year was a beta year. This year we're rolling out, and we have a lot of excitement in the market for it. We partner with forward-thinking, providers to bolt on high margin brain restoration programs into their existing clinics. So we install a complete system. And so, this gets wonderful outcomes to your communities, and, it gets measurable outcomes and helps to drive the economics of your clinic. And so if you're interested, you can find us at brainrestorecenters.com. We are revising the website now, so don't mind the overhaul, but you can still find us and connect us there. But that's how you find me. I'm over there spending a lot of my time trying to make an impact, because our mission is to conquer one of the biggest epidemics that's out there, and that's the decline in brain health. And we want to be a supporting structure to that. So that's what we're doing.
I love it. And that's the only place you'll ever find him, because I can't find him anywhere else. So good luck. But thank you for being on the show, brother. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you so much, Corey. Appreciate it.